Chapter 3. That was logical, but wrong. The mouse was back the very next evening, which just happened to be the first of Percy Wetmore's 2 nights off before he slid over to the graveyard shift. Steamboat Willie showed up around 7 o'clock. I was there to see his reappearance. So was Dean. Harry Terwilliger too. Harry was on the desk. I was technically on days, but had stuck around to spend an extra hour with the chief, whose time was getting close by then. Bitterbuck was stoically on the outside, in the tradition of his tribe, but I could see his fear of the end growing inside him like a poison flower. So we talked. You could talk to them in the daytime, but it wasn't so good, with the shouts and conversation, not to mention the occasional fist fight, coming from the exercise yard, the chunk, chunk, chunk of the stamping machines in the plate shop, the occasional yell of a guard for someone to put down that pick or grab up that hoe, or just to get your ass over here, Harvey. After 4 it got a little better, and after 6 it got better still. 6 to 8 was the optimum time. After that you could see the long thoughts starting to steal over their minds again. In their eyes you could see it, like afternoon shadows, and it was best to stop. They still heard what you were saying, but it no longer made sense to them. Past 8 they were getting ready for the watches of the night and imagining how the cap would feel when it was clamped to the top of their heads, and how the air would smell inside the black bag which had been rolled down over their sweaty faces. But I got the chief at a good time. He told me about his first wife and how they had built a lodge together up in Montana. Those had been the happiest days of his life, he said. The water was so pure and so cold that it felt like your mouth was cut every time you drank. "Hey, Mr. Edgecombe," he said, "you think if a man he sincerely repent of what he done wrong, he might get to go back to the time that was happiest for him and live there forever? Could that be what heaven is like?" "I've just about believed that very thing," I said, which was a lie I didn't regret in the least. I had learned of matters internal at my mother's pretty knee, and what I believed is what the good book says about murderers, that there is no eternal life in them. I think they go straight to hell, where they burn in torment until God finally gives Gabriel the nod to blow the judgment trump. When he does, they'll wink out, and probably glad to go they will be. But I never gave a hint of such beliefs to Bitterbuck, or to any of them. I think in their hearts they knew it. "Where is your brother? His blood crieth to me from the ground," God said to Cain. And I doubt if the words were much of a surprise to that particular problem child. I bet he heard Abel's blood whining out of the earth at him with each step he took. The chief was smiling when I left, perhaps thinking about his lodge in Montana and his wife lying bare-breasted in the light of the fire. He would be walking in a warmer fire soon, I had no doubt. I went back up the corridor, and Dean told me about his set-to with Percy the previous night. I think he'd waited around just so he could, and I listened carefully. I always listened carefully when the subject was Percy, because I agreed with Dean 100%. I thought Percy was the sort of man who could cause a lot of trouble, as much for the rest of us as for himself. As Dean was finishing, old Toot-Toot came by with his red snack wagon, which was covered with hand-lettered Bible quotes. "Repent, for the Lord shall judge his people," Deuteronomy 32, verse 36. "And surely your blood of your lives will I require," Genesis 9, verse 5. And similarly cheery, uplifting sentiments. And sold us some sandwiches and pops. Dean was hunting for change in his pocket and saying that we wouldn't see Steamboat Willie anymore. That goddamn Percy Wetmore had scared him off for good. When old Toot-Toot said, "What's that there, then?" And we looked, and here came the mouse of the hour, his own self, hopping up the middle of the Green Mile. He'd come a little way, then stop, look around with his bright little oil-drop eyes, then come on again. "Hey, mouse," the chief said, and the mouse stopped and looked at him, whiskers twitching. I tell you, it was exactly as if the damn thing knew it had been called. "You some kind of spirit guide?" Bitterbuck tossed the mouse a little morsel of cheese from his supper. It landed right in front of the mouse, but Steamboat Willie hardly even glanced at it, just came on his way again, up the Green Mile, looking in empty cells. "Boss Edgecombe," the president called. "Do you think that little bastard knows Wetmore isn't here? I do, by God." I felt about the same, but I wasn't going to say so out loud. Harry came out into the hall, hitching up his pants the way he always did after he'd spent a refreshing few minutes in the can, and stood there with his eyes wide. Toot-Toot was also staring, a sunken grin doing unpleasant things to the soft and toothless lower half of his face. The mouse stopped in what was becoming its usual spot, curled its tail around its paws, and looked at us. Again, I was reminded of pictures I had seen of judges passing sentence on hapless prisoners. Yet, had there ever been a prisoner as small and unafraid as this one? Not that it really was a prisoner, of course. It could come and go pretty much as it pleased. Yet the idea would not leave my mind, and it again occurred to me that most of us would feel that small when approaching God's judgment seat after our lives were over. But very few of us would be able to look so unafraid. "Well, I swear," old Toot-Toot said, "there he sits, big as Billy be frigged." "You ain't seen nothing yet, Toot," Harry said. "Watch this." He reached into his breast pocket and came out with a slice of cinnamon apple wrapped in waxed paper. He broke off the end and tossed it on the floor. It was dry and hard, and I thought it would bounce right past the mouse. But it reached out one paw, as carelessly as a man swatting at a fly to pass the time, and battered it flat. We all laughed in admiration and surprise, an outburst of sound that should have sent the mouse skittering, but it barely twitched. It picked up the piece of dried apple in its paws, gave it a couple of licks, then dropped it and looked up at us as if to say, "Not bad, what else do you have?" Toot-Toot opened his cart, took out a sandwich, unwrapped it, and tore off a scrap of bologna. "Don't bother," Dean said. "What do you mean?" Toot-Toot asked. "Ain't a mouse alive would pass up bologna if he could get it. You a crazy guy." But I knew Dean was right, and I could see by Harry's face that he knew it too. There were floaters, and there were regulars. Somehow, that mouse seemed to know the difference. Nuts, but true. Old Toot-Toot tossed the scrap of bologna down, and sure enough, the mouse wouldn't have a thing to do with it. Sniffed it once, and then backed off a pace. "I'll be a goddamn son of a bitch," old Toot-Toot said, sounding offended. I held out my hand. "Give it to me." "What? Same sandwich?" "Same one. I'll pay for it." Toot-Toot handed it over. I lifted the top slice of bread, tore off another sliver of meat, and dropped it over the front of the duty desk. The mouse came forward at once, picked it up in its paws, and began to eat. The bologna was gone before you could say Jack Robinson. "Help, goddamned!" Toot-Toot cried. "Bloody hell, gimme that!" He snatched back the sandwich, tore off a much larger piece of meat, not a scrap this time, but a flap, and dropped it so close to the mouse that Steamboat Willie almost ended up wearing it for a hat. It drew back again, sniffed. Surely no mouse ever hit such a jackpot during the Depression. Not in our state, at least. And then looked up at us. "Go on, eat it," Toot-Toot said, sounding more offended than ever. "What's wrong with you?" Dean took the sandwich and dropped a piece of meat. By then it was like some strange communion service. The mouse picked it up at once and bolted it down. Then it turned and went back down the corridor to the restraint room, pausing along the way to peer into a couple of empty cells and to take a brief investigatory tour of the third. Once again, the idea that it was looking for someone occurred to me, and this time I dismissed the thought more slowly. "I'm not going to ask about this," Harry said. He sounded as if he was half joking, half not. "First of all, nobody'd care. Second, they wouldn't believe me if they did." "He only ate from you fellas," Toot-Toot said. He shook his head in disbelief, then bent laboriously over, picked up what the mouse had disdained, and popped it into his own toothless maw, where he began the job of gumming it into submission. "Now why he do that?" "I've got a better one," Harry said. "How do you know Percy was off?" "He didn't," I said. "It was just coincidence, that mouse showing up tonight." Except that got harder and harder to believe as the days went by, and the mouse showed up only when Percy was off, on another shift or in another part of the prison. We, Harry, Dean, Brutal and me, decided that it must know Percy's voice or his smell. We carefully avoided too much discussion about the mouse himself. That, we seem to have decided without saying a word, might go a long way towards spoiling something that was special and beautiful. By virtue of its strangeness and delicacy, Willie had chosen us, after all, in some way I do not understand, even now. Maybe Harry came closest when he said it would do no good to tell other people, not just because they wouldn't believe, but because they wouldn't care. Chapter 4. Then it was time for the execution of Arlen Bitterbuck, in reality no chief but first elder of his tribe on the Washiti Reservation, and a member of the Cherokee Council as well. He had killed a man while both of them were drunk, in fact. The chief had crushed the man's head with a cement block. At issue had been a pair of boots. So, on July 17th of that rainy summer, my council of elders intended for his life to end. Visiting hours for most Cold Mountain prisoners were as rigid as steel beams, but that didn't hold for our boys on E Block. So, on the 16th, Bitterbuck was allowed over to the long room adjacent to the cafeteria, the arcade. It was divided straight down the middle by mesh interwoven with strands of barbed wire. Here, the chief would visit with his second wife, and those of his children who would still treat with him. It was time for the goodbyes. He was taken over there by Bill Dodge and 2 other floaters. The rest of us had work to do. 1 hour to cram in at least 2 rehearsals. 3, if we could manage it. Percy didn't make much protest over being put in the switch room with Jack Van Hay for the Bitterbuck electrocution. He was too green to know if he was being given a good spot or a bad one. What he did know was that he had a rectangular mesh window to look through, and although he probably didn't care to be looking at the back of the chair instead of the front, he would still be close enough to see the sparks fly. Right outside that window was a black wall telephone with no crank or dial on it. That phone could only ring in, and only from one place. The governor's office. I've seen lots of jailhouse movies over the years where the official phone rings just as they're getting ready to pull the switch on some poor innocent sap. But ours never rang during all my years on E Block. Never once. In the movies, salvation is cheap. So is innocence. You pay a quarter, and a quarter's worth is just what you get. Real life costs more, and most of the answers are different. We had a tailor's dummy down in the tunnel for the run to the meat wagon, and we had old Toot-Toot for the rest. Over the years, Toot had somehow become the traditional stand-in for the condemned, as time-honored in his way as the goose you sit down to on Christmas, whether you like goose or not. Most of the other screws liked him, were amused by his funny accent, also French, but Canadian rather than Cajun, and softened into its own thing by his years of incarceration in the South. Even Brutal got a kick out of old Toot. Not me, though. I thought he was, in his way, an older and dimmer version of Percy Wetmore, a man too squeamish to kill and cook his own meat, but who did, all the same, just love the smell of a barbecue. We were all there for the rehearsal, just as we would all be there for the main event. Brutus Howell had been put out, as we said, which meant that he would place the cap, monitor the governor's phone line, summon the doctor from his place by the wall if he was needed, and give the actual order to roll on 2 when the time came. If it went well, there would be no credit for anyone. If it didn't go well, Brutal would be blamed by the witnesses, and I would be blamed by the warden. Neither of us complained about this. It wouldn't have done any good. The world turns, that's all. You can hold on and turn with it, or stand up to protest and be spun right off. Dean, Harry Tawilga and I walked down to the chief's cell for the first rehearsal, not 3 minutes after Bill and his troops had escorted Bitterbuck off the block and over to the arcade. The cell door was open, and old Toot-Toot sat on the chief's bunk, his wispy white hair flying. "There comes the stains all over the sheet," Toot-Toot remarked. "He must be trying to get rid of it before you fellas boil it off." And he cackled. "Shut up, Toot," Dean said. Let's play this serious." "Okay," Toot-Toot said, immediately composing his face into an expression of thunderous gravity. But his eyes twinkled. Old Toot never looked so alive as when he was playing dead. I stepped forward. "Arlen Bitterbuck, as an officer of the court and of the state of blah blah, I have a warrant for blah blah, such execution to be carried out at 12:01 on blah blah. Will you step forward?" Toot got off the bunk. "I'm stepping forward, I'm stepping forward, I'm stepping forward," he said. "Turn around," Bean said, and when Toot-Toot turned, Bean examined the dandruffy top of his head. The crown of the chief's head would be shaved tomorrow night, and Bean's check would then be to make sure he didn't need a touch-up. Stubble could impede conduction, make things harder. Everything we were doing today was about making things easier. "All right, Arlen, let's go," I said to Toot-Toot, and away we went. "I'm walking down the corridor, I'm walking down the corridor, I'm walking down the corridor," Toot said. I flanked him on the left, Bean on the right. Harry was directly behind him. At the head of the corridor we turned right, away from life as it was lived in the exercise yard, and toward death as it was died in the storage room. We went into my office, and Toot dropped to his knees without having to be asked. He knew the script all right, probably better than any of us. God knew he'd been there longer than any of us. "I'm praying, I'm praying, I'm praying," Toot-Toot said, holding his gnarled hands up. They looked like that famous engraving. You probably know the one I mean. "The Lord is my shepherd," so on and so forth. "Who's Bitterbuck got?" Harry asked. "We're not going to have some karaoke medicine man in here shaking his dick, are we?" "Actually, still praying, still praying, still getting right with Jesus," Toot overrode me. "Shut up, you old gink," Dean said. "I'm praying." "Then pray to yourself." "What's keeping you guys?" Brutus hollered in from the storage room. That had also been emptied for our use. We were in the killing zone again, all right. It was a thing you could almost smell. "Hold your freaking water," Harry yelled back. "Don't be so goddamn impatient." "Praying," Toot said, grinning his unpleasant sunken grin. "Praying for patience. Just a little goddamn patience." "Actually, Bitterbuck's a Christian, he says," I told them, "and he's perfectly happy with the Baptist guy who came from Tillman Clock. Schuster is his name. I like him too. He's fast, and he doesn't get them all worked up." "On your feet, Toot. You prayed enough for one day." "Walking," Toot said. "Walking again, walking again. Yes, sir, walking on the Green Mile." Short as he was, he still had to duck a little to get through the door on the far side of the office. The rest of us had to duck even more. This was a vulnerable time with the real prisoner, and when I looked across to the platform where old Sparky stood and saw Brutal with his gun drawn, I nodded with satisfaction. Just right. Toot-Toot went down the steps and stopped. The folding wooden chairs, about 40 of them, were already in place. Bitterbuck would cross to the platform on an angle that would keep him safely away from the seated spectators, and 6 guards would be added for insurance. Bill Dodge would be in charge of those. We had never had a witness menaced by a condemned prisoner in spite of what was, admittedly, a raw setup, and that was how I meant to keep it. "Ready, boys?" Toot asked when we were back in our original formation at the foot of the stairs leading down from my office. I nodded, and we walked to the platform. What we looked like more than anything, I often thought, was a colour guard that had forgotten its flag. "What am I supposed to do?" Percy called from behind the wire mesh between the storage room and the switch room. "Watch and learn," I called back. "And keep your hands off your wiener," Harry muttered. Toot-Toot heard him, though, and cackled. We escorted him up onto the platform, and Toot turned around on his own, the old vet in action. "Sitting down," he said. Sitting down, taking a seat in old Sparky's lap." I dropped to my right knee before his right leg. Bean dropped to his left knee before his left leg. It was at this point we ourselves would be most vulnerable to physical attack, should the condemned man go berserk, which, every now and then, they did. We both turned the cocked knee slightly inward to protect the crotch area. We dropped our chins to protect our throats. And, of course, we moved to secure the ankles and neutralize the danger as fast as we could. The chief would be wearing slippers when he took his final promenade, but it could have been worse. Isn't much comfort to a man with a ruptured larynx, or writhing on the floor with his balls swelling up to the size of mason jars for that matter, while 40 or so spectators, many of them gentlemen of the press, sit in those Grange Hall chairs watching the whole thing. We clamped Toot-Toot's ankles. The clamp on Dean's side was slightly bigger because it carried the juice. When Bitterbuck sat down tomorrow night, he would do so with a shaved left calf. Indians have very little body hair as a rule, but we would take no chances. While we were clamping Toot-Toot's ankle, Brutus secured his right wrist. Harry stepped smoothly forward and clamped the left. When they were done, Harry nodded to Brutus, and Brutus called back to Van Hay, "Roll on one." I heard Percy asking Jack Van Hay what that meant. It was hard to believe how little he knew, how little he'd picked up during his time on E-Block. And Van Hay's murmur of explanation. Today, roll on one meant nothing. But when he heard Brutus say it tomorrow night, Van Hay would turn the knob that goosed the prisoner generator behind Bebop. The witness would hear the Jenny as a steady, low humming, and the lights all over the prison would brighten. In the other cell blocks, prisoners would observe those overbright lights and think it had happened. The execution was over, when in fact it was just beginning. Brutus stepped around the chair so that Toot could see him. "Arlen Bitterbuck, you have been condemned to die in the electric chair, sentence passed by a jury of your peers and imposed by a judge in good standing in this state. God save the people of this state. Do you have anything to say before sentence is carried out?" "Yeah," Toot said, eyes gleaming, lips bunched in a toothless, happy grin. "I want a fried chicken dinner with gravy on the taters. I want to shit in your hat, and I got to have Mae West sit on my face, because I'm one horny motherfucker." Brutus tried to hold on to his stern expression, but it was impossible. He threw back his head and began laughing. Dean collapsed onto the edge of the platform like he'd been gut-shot, head down between his knees, howling like a coyote, with one hand clapped to his brow, as if to keep his brains in there where they belonged. Harry was knocking his own head against the wall and going ha 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 as if he had a glob of food stuck in his throat. Even Jack Van Hay, a man not known for his sense of humour, was laughing. I felt like it myself, of course I did, but controlled it somehow. Tomorrow night it was going to be for real, and a man would die there where Toot-Toot was sitting. "Shut up, Brutal," I said. "You too, Dean, Harry and Toot. The next remark like that to come out of your mouth will be your loss. I'll have Van Hay roll on too for real." Toot gave me a grin as if to say, "That was a good one, Boss Edgecombe, a real good one." It faltered into a narrow, puzzled look when he saw I wasn't answering it. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. "It's not funny," I said. "That's what's wrong with me. And if you're not smart enough to get it, you better just keep your gob shut." Except it was funny in its way, and I suppose that was what had really made me mad. I looked around, saw Brutus staring at me, still grinning a little. "Shit," I said. "I'm getting too old for this job." "Nah," Brutus said. "You're in your prime, Paul." But I wasn't. Neither was he. Not as far as this goddamn job went, and both of us knew it. Still, the important thing was that the laughing fit had passed. That was good, because the last thing I wanted was somebody remembering Toot's smart aleck remark tomorrow night and getting going again. You'd say such a thing would be impossible, a guard laughing his ass off as he escorted a condemned man past the witnesses to the electric chair. But when men are under stress, anything can happen. And a thing like that, people would have talked about it for 20 years. "Are you going to be quiet, Toot?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, his averted face that of the world's oldest, poutiest child. I nodded to Brutal that he should get on with the rehearsal. He took the mask from the brass hook on the back of the chair and rolled it down over Toot-Toot's head, pulling it snug under his chin, which opened the hole at the top to its widest diameter. Then Brutal leaned over, picked the wet circle of sponge out of the bucket, pressed one finger against it, then licked the tip of the finger. That done, he put the sponge back in the bucket. Tomorrow he wouldn't. Tomorrow he would tuck it into the cap perched on the back of the chair. Not today, though. There was no need to get Toot's old head wet. The cap was steel, and with the straps dangling down on either side, it looked sort of like a doughboy's helmet. Brutal put it on old Toot-Toot's head, snugging it down over the hole in the black head covering. "Getting the cap, getting the cap, getting the cap," Toot said, and now his voice sounded squeezed as well as muffled. The straps held his jaw almost closed, and I suspected Brutal had snugged it down a little tighter than he strictly had to for purposes of rehearsal. He stepped back, faced the empty seats, and said, "Arlen Bitterbuck, electricity shall now be passed through your body until you are dead, in accordance with state law. May God have mercy on your soul." Brutal turned to the mesh-covered rectangle. "Roll on 2. Old Toot, perhaps trying to recapture his earlier flair of comic genius, began to buck and flail in the chair, as old Sparky's actual customers almost never did. "Now I'm frying," he cried. "Frying, frying, yeah! I'm a Don-Tom turkey." Harry and Dean, I saw, were not watching this at all. They had turned away from Sparky and were looking across the emptied storage room at the door leading back into my office. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Harry said. One of the witnesses came a day early. Sitting in the doorway, with its tail curled neatly around its paws, watching with its beady, black, oil spot eyes, was the mouse.